June 1954, Route 66, Arizona, 7 miles east of Oatman. The Mojave Desert in June does not negotiate. The temperature at noon is 108 degrees and has been at or above 100 degrees every day for the last 3 weeks. The road through the Black Mountains east of Oatman is the original Route 66 alignment, the one that goes over the mountains instead of around them, the one that trucks stopped using in 1952 because the grade is too steep and the curves are too sharp, but that passenger cars still use because it is shorter and because there is something in the road over the mountains that the road around them does not have. Roy Rogers is riding Trigger east on the mountain road. He is going to a ranching property 6 miles past Oatman, where a man named Halverson has a quarter horse he has been trying to sell and that Roy Rogers has agreed to look at as a favor to a mutual friend in California, because looking at horses is not a hardship and Oatman is not out of the way from anything he needs to be near today. The road is empty. The desert is empty. The Black Mountains are not empty. They are full of the particular density of a mountain range that has been mined for gold since 1863 and that has more abandoned shafts and collapsed tunnels than anyone has bothered to count. But the life in them is the life of rock and heat and the occasional hawk that finds the thermals above the ridgeline and goes around rather than over. Trigger is doing what Trigger does on a mountain road in June, moving at his own considered pace, ears forward, reading the road the way a horse reads a road when the road has qualities worth reading. He slows before Roy Rogers sees anything. The boy is 50 yards ahead on the right side of the road. He is running toward the mountain, not away from it. He is 8 or 9 years old, wearing a red shirt that is soaked through with sweat, and he is moving with the particular urgency of a child who does not have time to be frightened because being frightened would slow him down, and he cannot be slowed down. Roy Rogers watches him for 2 seconds. He sees the direction the boy is running. He sees, set back from the road and the loose rock and scrub of the mountainside, the timber frame of an abandoned mine shaft entrance. He pulls Trigger off the road. The mine shaft entrance is partially collapsed. It was someone's claim once. One of the thousands worked in these mountains between the 1860s and the 1930s. The gold that came out of the Black Mountains funding the town of Oatman for 50 years, and then running thin, and then running out, and then not running at all. And the shafts left behind by the men who worked them settling slowly back into the mountain at the pace of things that no longer have a reason to stand. The timber frame above the entrance is intact. The entrance itself is 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall and goes into the mountain at a slight downward angle, the interior dark after the first few feet. There is a wooden sign nailed to the frame: "Danger, abandoned mine, no trespassing," bleached almost white by the Arizona sun, the letters still legible. The boy stops at the entrance and turns and sees Roy Rogers coming off the road on Trigger. He says, "My sister is in there." He says it the way children say the most important thing, directly, without preamble, because there is no time for preamble, and he has been running, and the preamble would take time he does not have. Roy Rogers gets down from Trigger. He ties Trigger to the mine frame post. He crouches to the boy's eye level. He says, "How long has she been in there?" The boy says, "She went in about 10 minutes ago. We were looking at the rocks. She went in and then there was a sound and I couldn't hear her anymore." Roy Rogers says, "How old is she?" The boy says, 6. Roy Rogers looks at the entrance. He says, "What's your name?" The boy says, "Thomas." Roy Rogers says, "Thomas, I need you to stay out here with Trigger. Can you do that?" Thomas says, "Yes, sir." Roy Rogers says, "If I'm not out in 20 minutes, ride Trigger back down to the road and flag down the first car you see and tell them to get help from Oatman." Thomas says, "I can't ride a horse." Roy Rogers looks at him. He says, Trigger will take care of the riding. You just have to stay on. He stands up. He goes into the mine. The interior goes from bright to dim to dark in the space of 15 feet. Roy Rogers has a flashlight in his saddlebag. He carries one because desert riding in the morning hours before dawn requires it, and because a flashlight in a saddlebag takes no room and has unlimited potential applications. He has it now. The beam is adequate. The tunnel is shored with timber, the same timber as the entrance frame, the same state of gradual settlement. The floor is hard rock, irregular, the kind of surface that requires attention at a walk. He moves at a careful walk. The tunnel goes straight for 30 feet, then curves left, then goes straight again. The curve is where the darkness becomes complete. Past the curve, no light from the entrance reaches. He is on his own with the flashlight. He says, "Hello? Can you hear me?" Silence. He says, "My name is Roy Rogers. I'm a friend of your brother, Thomas. Can you call out so I know where you are?" A sound from ahead, small, the sound of a child who has been quiet because quiet seemed correct and is now less sure. He says, "That's good. Keep making that sound." He moves toward it. The girl is 40 feet past the curve, in a section of tunnel that has partially collapsed. The collapse is on the right side. A section of the timbered wall has given way, the rocks and dirt coming in from a height of about 4 feet, filling half the tunnel width with loose material. The girl is on the left side of the collapse, between the debris and the far wall, a space of about 2 feet. She is sitting with her knees pulled up, her back to the wall, unhurt. Her name is Alice. She is 6 years old. She has brown hair and a blue shirt, and she is covered in dust from the collapse, which happened 6 inches to her right and which frightened her into stillness and which she has been sitting with in the dark for 10 minutes. She looks at Roy Rogers' flashlight. She says, "I can hear Thomas outside." Roy Rogers says, "Thomas sent me in." She says, "Is Thomas okay?" Roy Rogers says, "Thomas is fine. He's waiting with my horse." She considers this. She says, "You have a horse?" Roy Rogers says, "I do. His name is Trigger. You can meet him when we get out." She says, "Okay." The problem is the collapse. Roy Rogers examines it with the flashlight. The material that came down is loose rock and dirt, not the solid face of the mountain. It is the fill that was packed around the original timbering, working loose over the decades, finally deciding that now was the time. The collapse has filled the right half of the tunnel for about 4 feet of length. The left side, where Alice is clear. He can go around, barely. He turns sideways and moves through the 2-foot gap between the collapsed debris and the left wall, the debris on his right shoulder as he passes, the wall on his left. He gets through without disturbing anything. He crouches beside Alice. He says, "Are you hurt anywhere?" She says, "No." He says, "Can you walk?" She says, "Yes." He says, "I'm going to carry you through the narrow part, and then we're going to walk out together. Is that all right?" She says, "Yes." He says, "Put your arms around my neck." She does. He stands. Getting back through the collapse with Alice is slower than coming through alone. He turns sideways again, Alice on his left side, her arms around his neck, his left hand under her, his right hand against the debris pile for balance. The debris shifts slightly as he passes. He feels it shift and stops for a moment, and the shifting stops, and he continues. He does not hurry. Hurrying in a partially collapsed mine shaft with a 6-year-old is not the correct response to the situation. The correct response is the pace that does not disturb the debris, which is slow and deliberate. and the pace that does not communicate alarm to the child, which is calm and steady. And these are the same pace. They come through the collapse. He carries Alice the rest of the way, through the second straight section, through the curve, through the first straight section, the light from the entrance growing from nothing to dim to bright, the Arizona June heat arriving ahead of the light, the heat outside a relief after the cold of the mine interior. He steps out of the mine. Thomas is where he left him. He is standing beside Trigger with his hand on the horse's neck, which is the correct position for a boy who cannot ride but who has been told to stay with the horse and has taken this seriously. Trigger is standing with the particular patience of a horse that has been told to wait and is waiting, the reins tied to the mine frame post, the June heat around him. Thomas sees Alice. He says, "Are you okay?" Alice says, "There was a big noise and it got dark." Thomas says, "I know, I heard it." Alice says, "A man came and got me." Thomas looks at Roy Rogers. Roy Rogers sets Alice down on her feet. She is dusty and small and entirely composed, the composure of a 6-year-old who did not cry in the dark and is not going to cry now either. Roy Rogers says to Thomas, "Do you live near here?" Thomas says, "Our house is back that way, about a mile." Roy Rogers says, "I'll ride you both back." Thomas says, "I thought I couldn't ride." Roy Rogers says, "You'll be with me. Trigger won't mind." They ride back the mile to the house. Roy Rogers in the saddle, Thomas in front of him, Alice behind him with her arms around his waist, Trigger picking his way down the mountain road at a pace appropriate for 3 riders and a June afternoon. The house is a small frame house set back from a dirt track, a water tower beside it, a garden on the south side that is fighting the heat with mixed results. A woman comes out of the house when she sees the horse. Her name is Doris. She is the children's mother. She has been hanging laundry in the back and has not known that Thomas and Alice have been gone for 40 minutes. She sees the dust on Alice. She says, "What happened?" Alice says, "I went in a mine and a man came and got me." Doris looks at Roy Rogers. Roy Rogers says, "She's not hurt. The tunnel had a partial collapse after she went in." Doris puts her hand over her mouth. Then she takes it away. She says, "Which mine?" Roy Rogers describes the location, 7 miles east of Oatman, off the road, timber frame entrance. Doris says, "I know the one. I've told them 100 times not to go near it." Thomas says, "We were looking at rocks." Doris says, "Thomas?" Thomas is quiet. Roy Rogers says, "They're both fine." Doris says, "I know. Thank you." She is looking at him the way people look at him when they have recognized him, but the recognition is not the point, and she is not going to make it the point because Alice is dusty and Thomas needs to be talked to and there is laundry in the back. She says, "Can I get you water?" Roy Rogers says, "I'd be grateful." He gets down from Trigger and they go inside. He stays for 30 minutes. He drinks the water and eats the piece of cornbread that Doris puts in front of him. He watches Alice come back to the kitchen in a different shirt, the dust gone from her face. She says to Roy Rogers, "Can I see Trigger?" He says, "Yes." They go outside. Roy Rogers holds Trigger's lead while Alice puts her hand on the horse's nose, the way 6-year-olds approach horses. Cautious first, then not cautious. Trigger stands for it. Alice says, "He's big." Roy Rogers says, "He knows it." She says, "Is he the Trigger? From the movies?" Roy Rogers says, "There's only one." Alice thinks about this. She says, "He came into a dark place for me." Roy Rogers says, "That's his job." He means himself, not the horse. But the horse is standing there taking it in the way horses take things in, and it seems to Roy Rogers that Trigger does not object to the credit. He says goodbye to Doris and Thomas and Alice. He gets back on Trigger. He rides east toward Halverson's ranch. He is 40 minutes late. Halverson does not ask where he was. Roy Rogers does not explain. They look at the quarter horse, which is a good horse, and which Roy Rogers says so, and he rides back to the road as the sun is going west over the Black Mountains, the mine shaft somewhere up there in the rock, the timber frame with its bleached warning sign, the entrance going back to the mountain, the way everything goes back eventually. Alice grew up in Oatman. She became a school teacher in Kingman and taught second grade for 28 years. She told the story once a year on the last day of school, not as a Roy Rogers story, as a darkness story. The part about sitting with the collapse on her right and the wall on her left and waiting, and then hearing a voice that said, "Keep making that sound." She said, "When you're in the dark and someone says, 'Keep making that sound,' you make the sound. That's all you have to do. The person will come toward it." She said the second graders always understood this. She said children understand the dark better than adults give them credit for. If this story reached you, drop your state in the comments. A new King of the Cowboys story every day, because they still make men like him. You just have to know where to look.